Morning, church. We were privileged to go out to the prison, Eddie Warrior, on Friday for baptisms, and God blessed us with 16 new sisters in Christ. I've said this several times. I really wish it were possible for everybody to go out and share in a time like that. It's really a faith builder when you see women whose lives have been destroyed by sin, and they give their lives to the Lord, and they walk down in that water, and so many of them have tears in their eyes. And you watch them come up out of that water, and a number of them are thrusting their arms up in victory. It's just a very, very special time. And the celebration that goes on at those baptisms as other women celebrate their new birth. It's just a really, really special time, and drives home how important it is that we continue that good work at Eddie Warrior and at Just Done. We've been talking about raising whole children in a broken world. And this morning, what I want to put an emphasis on is teaching your children the importance of boundaries. I believe this is incredibly important, particularly in this day and age. Now, what is a boundary? I think it's important that we define that first of all. Here's a picture, beautiful pasture, and you see a track through that tree, but there's an old wall running along there. That's a boundary. We all recognize and understand that. What does that boundary indicate? That indicates that on one side of that wall is somebody's property, and on the other side is another person's property. And this fellow on the left side isn't going to run his cattle over on that right side, at least not without permission, because that's not his property. There's a boundary that's been drawn right there. Now, in our lives, we have all kinds of boundaries, conscious and unconscious. For instance, when I watch people standing out in the foyer and we're talking out there, how close do you stand to the person that you're talking to? Most of us, and you don't take a yardstick and you don't measure, but you're giving that person that you talk to about 18 inches to 2 feet of space. And that's your boundary. And if somebody gets closer than that, what do? You start backing up. You may not even be consciously aware of the fact that that's going on, but that's exactly what's going on. In our culture, we kind of have this little circle around us, this boundary, and we keep consistently to that boundary. In so many areas of our life, that's true. And I think what's really important is that we understand not just physical boundaries, but that we understand the importance of moral and spiritual boundaries as well. And that's what I want us to focus on this morning. Now, drawing boundaries is an important biblical principle. And I want us to look at 3 examples from Scripture of the discussion of the importance of various types of boundaries. First of all, in the book of Job, chapter 31 and verse 1, Job makes a fascinating observation as he's talking about his own life and how he lives and the boundaries that he draws for himself. And he says, I have made a covenant with my eyes. How then could I gaze at a virgin? Now, if you read this in the NIV, they make it a little more explicit, I think. I made a covenant with my eyes not to look lustfully at a girl. Now, what's he saying? He is saying that I understand the importance of drawing personal boundaries, okay? And in my life, I have a personal boundary. And that boundary is that I am not going to look at a woman and think about her in a way I ought not to think. I'm not going to do it, okay? Now, that's an ongoing challenge to all males, and we know that. Okay, there's always that temptation to take that second look. And what Job is saying is, I have made it a personal boundary that I'm not going to step over that boundary. I think that's incredibly important, and that's one of the reasons why God will say, I have no man like him. Because here's a man who took his personal holiness very, very seriously and talks about the kind of boundaries that he drew in order to ensure that purity. Ephesians chapter 5. Verses 3 and 4. Here we find, I think, the Apostle Paul talking about social boundaries that we as Christians are to observe with each other. He says, but sexual immorality and all impurity or covetousness must not even be named among you, as is proper among saints. Let there be no filthiness, nor foolish talk, nor crude joking, which are out of place, but instead, let there be thanksgiving. In other words, we have a responsibility, I believe, not to throw spiritual garbage at each other. Now, we live in a world that tosses out that garbage all the time, doesn't it? Unfortunately, at work, probably, you're going to hear that all the time. At school, you're going to hear it all the time. You turn on the TV, it's going to be full of garbage. Paul says, listen, brothers and sisters in Christ, we have a responsibility to each other to draw boundaries and to say, listen, if I have conversation with you, it's going to be uplifting, it's going to be upbuilding, it's going to be spiritual in nature, it's going to be strengthening. We're both going to walk away from any interaction that we have, and we're going to feel better about ourselves and better about our relationship with the Lord. That's what we owe each other. Now, consider the challenges of social media. I've had the unfortunate experience, and I'm sure you have too, of seeing stuff posted on social media by brothers and sisters in Christ that embarrass me to death. They're filled with profanity, filthy jokes, that kind of thing. That is not appropriate. That's not who we are. Okay? It's not who we are. And if we put that kind of stuff on there, we betray the trust that God has placed in us to be a set-apart people. If we're a set-apart people, if we're a holy people, we are going to pay attention to what we put out there, what we share with others. And what we share with others is not going to be off color. It's not going to be dirty. It's not going to have double meanings. It's not going to be profane. It is going to be that which is going to build other people up. That's who we are. We need to draw those kind of boundaries in our lives and hold to them. And Paul says you've got a responsibility to do that. We have a responsibility to each other to do that. Now, a third kind of boundary, I think, is one that's just kind of all-purpose. And Paul mentions that in 1 Thessalonians 5:22. Abstain from every form of evil. Some translations will say from every appearance of evil. In other words, what should our moral and spiritual boundaries be based upon? And Paul, I think, makes it very simple. If it appears evil, you don't mess with it. Okay? Just steer clear of it. Now, that is not narrow-minded. That's not bigoted. Brothers and sisters, that's wise. He's saying, listen, if it's iffy to you, if you're going, do I need to be watching this? Do I need to be involved in this or not? If there's a question about it, if there's a taint to it, just don't do it. It's that simple. What is that? I think that is a safe, wise boundary that Paul says we need to draw in our lives. Now, having established that, what are your God-given responsibilities as a parent in regard to setting and honoring boundaries for your children? Let me share with you quickly 4 principles, I think, that are involved in setting boundaries for our kids. First of all, let your children observe you setting and keeping boundaries. Your example is a powerful, powerful tool. Again, I really believe with all my heart that Christian virtues are far more caught than they are taught. It's as you watch them live in the lives of others, as you see their example and you emulate their example, that's really how you develop these things. I have learned far more about mercy and forgiveness and grace and kindness watching other people than I have reading about it in a book. To see it literally, physically illustrated is incredibly important. And that certainly holds true when it comes to our example for our children. Brothers and sisters, I never saw my dad smoke a cigarette. I never saw my dad drink a beer. I never saw my dad take an illegal drug. Ever. Now, he didn't go around condemning everybody or preaching that or talking about that. In fact, I rarely ever heard him talk about that. But I know from his example how he felt about that. I know the boundaries that he drew for himself. And those boundaries were profound and they were kept by him. Did that have an influence on me? Better believe it did. Better believe it did. And I have tried to live up to my daddy's example in that way. And I can truthfully say my kids have never seen me smoke a cigarette. They've never seen me drink a beer. They've never seen me take an illegal drug. That kind of caught, not taught example is incredibly powerful. And that's the kind of example I believe that we need to soberly consider for our children. This old don't do as I do as I say carries very little moral authority. I believe one of the problems that so many people have today when they talk to their kids about alcohol abuse or drug abuse is the kids know they're drinking, the kids know they're using. And how can you talk to somebody about responsible usage of something when you're not responsible about it? One of the best gifts that you can give to your kids is a positive example in this regard. Now, does that mean you have to tell yourself no in some areas, that you're going to have to draw some arbitrary boundaries? Absolutely. Absolutely. But I believe that we owe that to our children to set those boundaries and to keep those boundaries. Now, secondly, let's set safe boundaries for your children. Now, what do we mean by that? I don't remember who said this. I'm quoting somebody, and for the life of me, I looked and I tried to find where I'd read this, and I couldn't find it. I'd love to give him credit, but I appreciate this. Children are like blind people searching for a wall. They need to know where the boundaries are. And that's very true. As kids grow up and they're in this moral morass that is the world, and they're trying to find their way along, they're like blind people walking in darkness, and they're trying to, where are the walls? Where are the boundaries in this life? Our role as parents is to protect our children, brethren. We betray them if we don't. My responsibility is to protect my 4 kids. And to the very best of my ability, that is what God gave me to do, to protect them. Now, I would argue that if you don't set boundaries for your children, you are not protecting your children. In fact, there's a very real sense, I believe, in which you are neglecting and abusing your children. Because your children desperately need those boundaries. They need to know this far and no farther. They need to see that in your life. They need to hear that from your lips. That is an incredibly important gift that you can give to them. Along this line, I think it's important to be willing to be the bad guy to protect your children. When my kids were teenagers and they would be invited to parties and things that they didn't need to go to, I'd tell them, no, you can't go. And so when they would go to their friends, and their friends would say, well, why didn't you come to the party? Well, my dad told me I couldn't go. I'm the bad guy. You know what? That's just fine. I'm perfectly glad to be the bad guy in a situation like that. And we need to be willing to be the bad guys in order to protect our children and to draw those walls that will keep them safe. Okay? Now, important. Keep the boundaries as few and simple as possible. Bad laws produce a lack of respect for good ones. You are not out to control your children. If you set out to control your children are going to rebel against you, and your children are going to rebel against that oppressive thumb on them. If they sense that you're trying to control them, you're going in the wrong direction. You are not trying to control them, you are trying to protect them. And there's a world of difference between protecting your children and controlling your children. Our calling is to protect them, not control them. And if your children know that what you're doing, and they may not agree with it, they're not always going to agree with it. Well, why won't you let me go? Well, it's not under discussion, you're not going. When there's that kind of ultimatum given, but they know that I'm doing this because I love them, because I want what's best for them, because I want to protect them. Ultimately, I believe that's going to produce a relationship of respect and love. Now, controlling is a whole different thing. Okay, if they feel like that you're just trying to control every aspect of their life and run them, they will rebel. And that is not what we're called to do. We're not called to control. We are called to protect. That means that you don't have 6 million laws written down, boundaries on every single solitary act in their life. But the important stuff, yes, sir, you've got boundaries. And they know what those boundaries are. And you hold to those boundaries. Be prepared, this is important, to enforce those boundaries when they're tested, because I guarantee you they're going to test them. Okay, you told me no yesterday, do you mean it today? With my mom and dad, I know you said last week I couldn't do this, but this is this week. Can I do this? We are naturally going to push and prod and check things out. Kids are, I did, you will, my kids did, that's the way it works. Do you really mean it? Now, I've used this example for years because I can't think of a better one than this one, and excuse me equating little kids with pigs, but it just works, okay? When I was a kid, we raised hogs on the farm, and after they farrowed in the wintertime come spring, we might have 50 baby pigs, okay? We had an area there on the place that grew a lot of lamb's quarter. If you're not familiar with lamb's quarter, that's kind of like spinach or poke. And pigs love lamb's quarter. When that lamb's quarter started coming up, we would run electric fence around that patch of lamb's quarter, and then we would let those baby pigs in on that lamb's quarter. What was fascinating was, after they had been there, just not very long at all, you would hear a squeal. And that would be one of those baby pigs going over and checking that wire to see if it was hot. And if it was hot, it would nail them and they'd squeal. And about every 15 minutes to 30 minutes, you would hear a squeal. There was always some baby pig going over, checking that fence to see it was still hot. And God forbid if it wasn't. Because if that wire shorted out or something like that happened, we would have 50 baby pigs all over the place. And that's kind of like trying to herd cats. It's very, very difficult to get those hogs back into that. But they were constantly checking to see, is the wire hot? Your kids are constantly going to be checking to see, do you still mean it? And they need to know in areas that matter, yep, the wire's still hot, I still mean it, no is still no, or yes is still yes. Both parents, this is so important, need to be on the same page. How often do kids work mom against dad and dad against mom? Well, dad will tell me no, but mom will tell me yes, so I'll run to mom. Or mom will tell me no and dad will tell me yes, so I'll run to dad. And you end up with divided parents and you end up with a mess. It's so important as parents, as moms and dads, and we've talked about this before, that you sit down with your kids and you draw up a list of this is what your responsibilities are and privileges and so on. And here are the consequences if you keep them, here are the consequences if you don't, and then you are in agreement and you abide by them. So that if Sally runs to Mama and says, Mama, Daddy said I couldn't. And Mama says, if Daddy said you couldn't, that's what we agreed on, you can't, then that's that. And you're not dividing the parents and you're not creating all kinds of issues and problems. And through the years, you've done any counseling, you've seen this. Doesn't happen. But both parents need to be on the same page. You owe that to your children, to be on the same page. Now, consequences for disobedience need to be laid out beforehand. Remember that boundaries are meaningless without consequences for violating them. If you look at the quandary this country's in right now over our borders, what it amounts to is we have got boundaries. But there are people who have decided those boundaries don't mean anything. There are laws to enforce those boundaries, and people have come along and said, fine, but we're not going to enforce those laws. Now, if they're not going to enforce the laws in regard to the boundaries, then the boundaries mean nothing. They're just suggestions. And we're not talking about making suggestions to your children. We're talking about designing safe boundaries for them. Suggestions are just that. God did not give the 10 suggestions at Sinai. He gave the 10 commandments. And there are consequences to disobeying those commandments. And there need to be consequences to disobeying when boundaries are stepped across. Again, otherwise, they're just suggestions. And it's important that we give our kids the safety of those boundaries. And lastly, the great challenge, I think, is to enable your children to learn to set their own boundaries. Our calling as parents is to prepare our children for war. Because that's exactly what they're going to be in. They're going to be in a war for their soul. And the world and the evil one is going to be after them right from the time they enter school, all the way through school. Once they get out of school, it's not going to let up a bit. They are in a war for their souls. And we have to do the very best that we can to prepare them to fight that war. To enable them, as Paul talks about in Ephesians chapter 6, to put on that full armor of God. By our teaching and example, we can show them where boundaries are important. And that's what we've been talking about. You establish your own personal boundaries, you hold to them, and your kids see that. You share with them simple boundaries, but boundaries that have consequences, and they know what those boundaries are, and they know why those boundaries exist. Now, keep in mind, each one of us as adults have set our own boundaries. I've got my boundaries, Carol has her boundaries, you've got your boundaries. We all have our own individual boundaries that we've set in our lives. Your children are going to do the same thing. Once they leave home, even before they leave home, they're going to be able to begin to establish their boundaries as well. Brothers and sisters, we're parents, we're not police. Once they leave home, their choices are their own. All we can do is what we can do to prepare them to go to war. But once they go to war, they make the decisions about which boundaries they're going to keep, which boundaries they're going to observe, which they're not, how they're going to live. And again, there are times, and there have been times, when I would have loved to have climbed in the car and driven down and enforced some boundaries for some of my kids, but I'm not the police. We taught them, we showed them, now they make the decisions about the boundaries that they're going to have in their lives. I've said forever, because this is absolutely true, if I make a mess spiritually, if I go off the deep end in some area and get involved in something that I should not be involved in, don't you dare ever blame my parents, because they taught me better and they showed me better. And if I make decisions about things and go in a direction I shouldn't go, it's not because mom and dad didn't teach me and didn't show me. It's because I'm a free moral agent, and if I choose to make a mess, I can choose to make a mess. But they told me about the mess. They showed me about the mess. They taught me against the mess. It's my choice. Eric's sitting out here, and I'm going to embarrass him, but it's okay, he's my son. He's in Iraq, fixing to come home, okay? And he calls, and we're talking, and I'll never forget. He says, Dad, I've been thinking about it, and I want you to know that when I get home, there's not going to be any alcohol in my life, and I'm not going to smoke. Now, there have been some of both. He said, it's gone. I've seen the damage that it does. I've seen marriages break up because of the alcohol. I've seen all the problems that it causes in people's lives. He drew a boundary. And he said, I'm going to keep to that boundary. And bless his heart, he has. He absolutely has. And I thank God for it. But that's one of those, yeah, moments. We get a call like that because, wow, that's what you pray for. That's what you work toward, is to see them draw their own boundaries by their choice and say, here is how I want to live my life. Here are the boundaries that I'm setting. That's the challenge that we face as parents. Now again, all of us know that God set boundaries for us. God's told us, you can go here, you can't go there, you can do this, you can't do that. And he's also been very specific about the consequences for those boundaries. Maybe you've been walking by some of them you shouldn't. If you have, maybe now's the time to make that right. To confess that, to seek prayer, to say, listen, I want to honor God in my life. I don't want to step across those boundaries anymore. Maybe it's time to make Jesus the Lord of your life. And to say, you know what, I'm sick of setting my own boundaries. Those haven't worked so well. I want to honor yours. I want to be your child. I want to confess my belief in the Son of God. I want to put him on in baptism. I want to live by his rules, not mine, because mine haven't worked so well. I'm ready to be baptized into Christ. If there's any way that we can help you in your walk with him, won't you come? While we stand and while we sing.
Hear the sweet voice of Jesus say, come unto me, I am the way, hearken the love in all the way, for he loves you the soul. Only a step, only a step, I'm for glad, for you and I. He's the same God, he's Savior yet, Jesus the crucified. Casting your head, be burdened down, come to the cross, the world may crown, yet you shall wear a glorious crown when he makes up his own. Only a step, only a step, come for me glad, for you and I. He's the same loving Savior yet, Jesus the crucified. Open for you the pearly gate, love was for you, now watch and wait. Terrible thought, too bright to lay, Jesus I come to thee. Only a step, only a step, come for me glad, for you and I. He's the same loving Savior yet, Jesus the crucified.